Alright guys, so 2025 is off to an explosive start. Well, what a world. The US just dropped a bombshell. Biden just reminded everyone that the US economy, they are making a big pivot. Now the old playbook of globalization and working with others is about to end. And if you thought the US just sanctioned China again, nope, didn't happen. The country getting punished this time is Japan. Now, President Biden just blocked Nippon Steel takeover of the historic company US Steel, and this led to the collapse of a 14 billion deal that had months of build-up. Now, understand what happened here. The Japanese steelmaker Nippon Steel wanted this very badly. They needed this deal for their long-term survival. Now, they made all kinds of concessions, they gave all kinds of guarantees, they promised cash bonuses to workers in US Steel, and things got pretty desperate here. The company actually offered to give the US government big veto powers, the power to stop any reduction in their steel production capacity going forward. So if US Steel, under Japanese control, decides to refine less steel, the US government can step in. Trump can demand them to maintain or even raise production. Now, I call this desperate because it goes against free market principles. You are allowing government control over a private company, which is extremely bizarre for the US. They are supposed to stand for freedom, right? So, why give up so much control to the US government? Why give all these concessions just to push the deal through? Simple, it's because Japan needs the US market. Now, within America, they can still compete. Most importantly, the US is closed off to Chinese steel, and that makes it extremely attractive to Nippon Steel. Now, since 2017, almost 100% of Chinese steel imports have been subjected to special tariffs. Now, compare that to under 50% for non China steel. It shows us how protected the US markets have truly become. Now, as a steel producer and an exporter, Japan would like nothing better than to enter a market that China is, well, discouraged from entering, which is something that's escalating fast. It's already happening under Biden and it's going to get even worse under Trump. In 2024, Biden took the tariff rate from 7.5% to 25% for steel. So Chinese imports into the US just got clobbered again. But this is nothing compared to what's coming in 2025. If Trump makes good on his trade war threat, the tariff rate on all Chinese goods will be insane. It would be 60% on everything, including steel. Now, bad news for China, but extremely good news for Japan. However, what just happened was a crushing blow to Japan and Nippon Steel. It kind of throws into question the entire steel industry in Japan and whether it's truly viable or not. It raises big questions regarding G7 allies. And what's the point of being a US ally and following them in almost everything when you get treated like this? You can take orders and damage your own economies to counter Russia and China. But when you want concessions, the US government says no. And it's a pretty one sided deal here. According to Biden, the reasoning is all about national security and how Japan's deal presents a credible threat. We need major US companies representing the major share of US steelmaking capacity to keep leading the fight on behalf of America's national interests. So the government is beginning to ring fence industries and manufacturing away from any foreign interference. So it's not just China getting hammered. Japan's deal would create risks for our national security and our critical supply chains. As a result, shares of US Steel collapsed by almost 6%. And if you're invested there, Gladiator, I salute you. And if you look at things from America's perspective, it does make some sense here. Now, what happened a few weeks ago? China began their trade retaliation against the Biden administration. Now, thanks to Biden's attack on EVs and solar imports, plus the semiconductor war, Beijing has had enough. They changed the game and they reminded the US of their biggest vulnerability. China banned shipments of gallium and germanium, critical minerals used in both civilian and the military, has been cut off. And this is especially detrimental to America's own semiconductor production. So, what we are seeing is a knee jerk reaction from the US. There's now this big scramble not just to reshore manufacturing, but to also protect vital supply chains. Now, according to the reports, Nippon Steel wants to challenge the order. But trying to challenge the US government is pointless because in 2025, we are going to see the most hawkish president in modern US history. Trump is coming back, and every country in the world is fair game. It's now pay to play. And for Japan, it's do or die because they can't compete against China in a global steel market. Beijing's supply chains and the entire ecosystem in general is simply unbeatable at this point when it comes to manufacturing. And here's what we mean. In 2023, guess who produced the most steel? China's number one, churning out 1 billion tons of steel. And that's easily more than half of the total world production. Now, Japan, on the other hand, is losing market share. They produced only 87 million tons of steel last year, and their output is 3 to 5% lower than the previous year. And here's another inconvenient thing. China is the largest consumer of steel. The biggest market is lost forever to Japan. Now, China's steel production will be used to satisfy their own growing domestic demand, and that's going to be the priority. Alright, now I get it, right? Oh, Sean, you're exaggerating. Everything with you is all to the extremes. End of the world this and end of the world that. The Japanese steel industry will be fine. They could always export to the US. Now, surely their allies, the Americans, would help them out, right? Well, let me challenge you on that. This chart shows us the total steel imports entering the United States. Now, in 2015, Japan exported almost 2.4 million tons of steel into the US, a very decent amount. But in 2023, Japan's steel exports fell to only 1 million tons, and that is a collapse of nearly 60%. It's a disaster. The US is importing less in general, so it is a shrinking market. Japan is selling less steel in both absolute quantities and in percentage terms as well. And this brings us to the ultimate realization: the only way for Nippon Steel to sell more to US companies, that is to produce steel within the US itself to avoid all the tariffs. And it's what Trump wants anyway, for foreign companies to build their production in the US directly. But US steel is different. Unfortunately for Japan, it is considered an asset protected by national security. Now, this doesn't bode well for Japanese steel and Japan's economy as a whole. The big problem, once again, is expensive manufacturing costs. And ever since the war started, Japan has been facing a problem that's getting worse. Almost 30% of Japan's energy generation is powered by LNG, the most expensive type of natural gas. So the price of electricity is through the roof. Meanwhile, their biggest industrial competitor, China, is winning. Because of the G7 sanctions on Russia, Putin is selling volumes to Beijing at a big discount. So now your manufacturing rival is getting huge amounts of cheap energy. And we are not even factoring in China's supply chains and controls of the input. And that's why manufacturing on Japanese soil is getting harder and harder. And here's the nail in the coffin. In a report from Reuters, it is confirmed that Japanese steel is no longer competitive in their own domestic market. Their steel imports for April to September hit a 10-year high. Their supply from China also hit a historic high. In other words, the price of Chinese steel is so affordable that even Japan themselves have to import supply in. Almost 500,000 tons of steel were purchased. And it's not a case of let's just shut China out. Tokyo needs these cheap inputs, or the other industries will face a squeeze. And this includes automotive and construction. And if you shut out Chinese steel, the price of cars and homes could rise sharply. So was Japan betrayed? Now, I don't think so. The US never made any promises. The Japanese, they just forgot one key fact. The biggest ally of the United States is the United States. And you can't really blame them really. Every nation's biggest ally is themselves, especially in 2025. So it's a little incredulous and a little sad when you hear statements from Tokyo, from Japan's trade minister. The decision is hard to understand and disappointing. But when you realize that the US economic policy is turning inwards, you could see this coming from a mile away. Now, as we said before, the US is not really interested in friendshoring. They are pursuing reshoring. It's a very different strategy. However, this marks a big turning point for US allies. Now, within the corridors of power, we can all imagine, we can all expect the G7 to ask serious questions. What are we getting in return for compliance? Now, we have followed the US to counter China. We caved under US pressure to punish Russia. We even seized the frozen assets as well. Now, where's our reward? Even the Clinton officials, they are in shock. The definition of national security is getting broader than what it used to be. Japan is one of America's closest allies. There are around 50,000 US troops here. In addition, Tokyo is about to buy $3.6 billion worth of American air-to-air missiles. US allies are big customers for the US military complex, the industrial complex. And where do you think Raytheon and Lockheed sells their stuff to? The G7 countries, they are big markets here, especially with China as the designated boogeyman in the closet. It's really bizarre and tragic at the same time. And this is why 2025 is going to be just so interesting. Now, what Biden did is just a preview, the appetizer before the main course. Now, Trump has his allies where he wants them. The G7 are dependent on the US consumer market, and because the world still runs on a dollar system, there has to be a constant flow of US currency to the global economy, especially the G7. Now, the economies on the left have the biggest exposure to the US. Canada, Mexico, and Europe, they all rely heavily on the US to import their goods. Now, China is already on a punishment list, and that's why Beijing is starting to decouple. But the G7 economies, they aren't really prepared. Over 1.2 trillion worth of exports to the US will get squeezed as Trump moves to cut the trade deficit. Let's not forget this, nearly 80% of Canada's exports goes to the US, while the EU is still highly dependent on US LNG. So they have very little leverage over Trump. Plus, there's always the nightmare of the US pulling away support from NATO. So there are genuine security concerns as well. Now, what does this mean? Well, it shows us that the US didn't really lose big over the last 3 years. The war didn't just benefit China, the US maneuvered themselves into a good position to squeeze their allies. And let's make this crystal clear, Trump likely isn't bluffing. And if Biden himself punished Japan, just imagine what will happen after Trump's inauguration.
My message is simple. Make your product here in America, and only in America. We are not going to be taken advantage of anymore, just as we made great inroads and progress 4 years ago. We made tremendous inroads on this subject. We're not going to watch our wealth and jobs get ripped away from us and sent to foreign countries, which is what's been happening for many, many decades with us.
Now, whether that ultimately works is up for debate, but from now until then, we could see a ton of chaos. Inflation, rates, and the markets will be on a roller coaster ride in 2025. So strap yourselves in, guys. The ship for economic Armageddon is leaving soon. But let me know what you think. Will the US reverse and unblock the deal? And does Japan have an escape plan? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.